Hello, my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. My guest today is Dr John Launer. John is a family physician, family therapist, educator and writer based in London. Following training in family medicine, he worked for over 20 years in a family practice in Edmonton, North London, an area with high levels of social deprivation. And he developed a particular interest in working with couples and families and subsequently in narrative medicine. In 1994, he completed training in family therapy at the Tavistock Clinic, the leading institute in the UK for psychological therapies and organisational psychology. Together with Caroline Lindsay, he developed the model of interactional skills, conversations inviting change. John was appointed in 2003 as an Associate Dean in Postgraduate Medical Education at the London Deanery, now part of Health Education England. Initially working in the General Practice Department, he later moved to Faculty Development, where he led a team of around 20 educators running courses in essential and advanced supervision skills using CIC. He also led the Educational Team Development Service, visiting hospitals across London to help teams of clinicians improve their teaching skills. He currently works as a Programme Director for Educational Innovation in Primary Care across most of London and for multi-professional clinical supervision in Kent. John, thank you so much for being my guest today on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure.
I'm so excited to be talking to you today because in our previous conversations, I've talked about how narrative medicine is something that I find really fascinating. It's obviously a field that I suppose is adjacent to my own in that it uses narrative and storytelling, but it's something that I'm just so interested in. As many of my listeners might not be aware of what narrative-based practice actually is in medicine, could you give us a brief outline of what narrative-based practice is and how is it different from the sort of normative medical practice?
Absolutely. Well, narrative medicine is based on an idea which has become very familiar in philosophy and the social sciences, which is that we understand ourselves in the stories we tell, that the stories we tell are not only descriptions of the world, but also, in a sense, create the world for us. As we tell them, we think about the world anew, we understand the world in different ways, and indeed the conversations we have with others when we tell the stories also help to recreate those stories. So really it puts stories and storytelling at the centre of the medical enterprise. We understand that when a person brings a problem to a physician or a healthcare professional, that problem may need a solution, but also the story needs a resolution. So there are two different tasks. There's the task of addressing the problem in an expert way, but there's also the task of being attentive to the story, witnessing the story, questioning the story in a way that invites reflection from both parties and hopefully allows a new kind of story to emerge. I should say I use the word story and narrative interchangeably. Narrative is a slightly better word to use because you can turn it into a verb, narrating, she narrated, so it gives a sense of flow.
It's funny, isn't it? It's often used interchangeably by a lot of practitioners in this field. I think it's one of the reasons why people find it slightly confusing. I know certainly when I was writing my doctoral thesis, I had a whole chapter on the differences between narrative and story and why
Yes.
different researchers and writers use the terms differently and interchangeably. It's very confusing.
Yes, indeed. In some academic circles, as you say, people do make quite fine distinctions. I think in terms of what I call narrative practice, which is the application of narrative ideas and skills to ordinary healthcare encounters, or indeed teachers use it in teaching and it's used in other fields as well. I think in terms of practice, it makes much more sense to use the words synonymously, and indeed it makes little sense to the ordinary practitioner in the street if you do anything different.
And I think from my own experience, I've found that sometimes people prefer the term narrative because it sounds more official, more grown up, whereas some people have an aversion to the term story. I don't know whether you found this, that it sort of takes them back to childhood and they don't want to do it because they feel like they won't be able to.
Yes, indeed, the word story to some people implies fiction, it implies fairy stories, as you say, it implies childhood. And a narrative, it can be very short. I mean, a patient coming to see a physician and saying, I've got a bunion, that's a narrative, or at least it's the beginning of a narrative, or it's the opening of a narrative. We wouldn't necessarily call it a story, but narrative or narrating, and I prefer the verb to the noun. Everybody understands that this is narrating. This is an act of narration.
And in practice, if you visited a medical practitioner and they were using this approach, as a patient, what would that feel like? What would you notice about their approach that might be different from other practitioners?
Well, I often say that I hope the patient wouldn't notice that there are any particular ideas or techniques being applied, but I hope they would come away with two impressions in particular. One is the doctor really listened. He or she paid attention to me, that in a way felt different and quite focused. And the second thing I hope they would say is, the doctor also asked me some very interesting questions. That they were different from the questions that I normally get asked, and they made me think about the context of my problem, various different dimensions of my problem. And you know what? They also made me think about things I hadn't thought about previously. So as I spoke, I suddenly thought, gosh, that's an interesting question. It's made me remember something that might be connected, or it's made me think of an option for myself that I hadn't previously thought about. So they would be aware of a very attentive doctor, and in a sense, a very creative doctor who was able to help them reconstruct their own story in their head. I mean, there is a school of narrative therapy, particularly in Australia, where they actually talk about helping people to re-story their lives. Now, I find that rather jargony, so I don't use it, but it does in some ways really capture the way that narrative practice works.
I think that's such an interesting point, that with all of these practices, you feel as if somebody noticed you were doing it, you would have missed the point somehow, that this
Exactly.
needs to feel natural and normal. Yes. I remember way back in the day, I did some training in NLP, which I know is not used so much now, but it was, that part of that was about, you, as soon as people start noticing you're doing it, you're not doing it right. It's being done in a false and inauthentic way.
Yes, and interestingly, when I first trained as a family therapist, and I took some of these ideas back to my practice as a GP, as a family physician, I think I used some of the techniques in quite clunky ways. And I can remember one elderly patient actually saying, I don't like you anymore. Fortunately, she knew me well enough to say it. And I said, why not? She said, well, we just used to kind of chat, and you'd come round to my house on a home visit, and we'd have a cup of tea together and so on. And now you're just firing questions at me. And I realized I was using it as inevitably as a novice. I was using it in quite a formulaic way and thinking that it worked through the techniques rather than through the stance. And I now often teach that now what we call the narrative attitude. It is a stance, it is a way of conceptualizing the world, it's a way of being with other people. And if you're using it like a kind of toolkit to sort of fit, a tab A into slot B, like putting a piece of furniture together, it simply doesn't work. It's got to be an attitude of mind.
I think I love that story. It's I'm sure I've had lots of those experiences myself when I've been trying things out in different ways of my own practice, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I do wonder sometimes whether that's what puts people off trying something new, because they know it will feel uncomfortable to begin with.
Indeed, and I think we need to warn novices of that and make them alert to it, and to help them understand that they may need to calibrate what they're doing in accordance with their normal forms of practice and what their patients or their clients expect of them. And it is an ongoing conversation with all their patients, all their clients, in which they find out what works best. And also they meet expectations. doctors are expected to be experts. They're expected to know things. They're expected to give advice and guidance and have opinions and follow the regulations and follow the law and follow the guidelines, and all these things need to be integrated. You used the word normative practice earlier, and it's something that we stress a lot, the need to integrate the normative and the narrative. And we use a number of metaphors to convey that. And my favourite metaphor is dumpling soup. The dumplings are the stuff of medicine. The dumplings are the evidence and the science and the facts and kind of irreducible truths. A broken bone is a broken bone. A stroke is a stroke. These are not stories. But we have to integrate the normative with the narrative. How are these irreducible facts understood? How do they impact on the person's life? How do they impact on the person's thinking and their feelings? Those are the narrative aspects, but we always, from not just from consultation to consultation, but from moment to moment, we need to be able to move in and out of the stuff of medicine, the normative, and the stories that people bring, the narrative.
That is very interesting, and I like the metaphor. As you were talking, I was thinking how this fits in the current environment. You know, we hear a lot in the news about the pressure that GPs and the NHS generally is under, and yes, time pressures. Do you find you get pushback from people when you're talking to them about this approach as something that they just won't be able to fit into their daily work?
I don't think I have ever given a presentation on narrative practice or run a workshop in it where the first question has not been, how do you do this in time? And I have a number of standard answers for it that I've developed over the years. The first is a kind of rebuttal of how much time do we waste by not doing this? How much time do we actually spend missing the point or not understanding what really matters to the person, and having firstly the conversation, the consultation goes on and on because they're trying to get us to hear something that we're not hearing. Secondly, they come back again and again and again. Thirdly, they go off to other people in the hope that they may listen to them more. So my argument is actually this is quite time efficient. If you're learning the techniques, of course, trying them out may prolong the consultation to start with. And we do hear reports from learners that initially it lengthens their conversation. Sometimes they say it opens a Pandora's box. But then you have to ask yourself the question, if you haven't opened that Pandora's box, what suffering is the patient left with that nobody has taken the trouble to inquire into? And if you have opened the Pandora's box, it actually then becomes much more manageable because you can ask questions like, you've let me know a lot of different aspects of this problem. Which one would you like me to focus on this occasion? And perhaps we can look at other aspects on other occasions. So I believe it actually makes the use of time more efficient.
I agree. And I get similar pushback sometimes when I'm working with leaders around incorporating storytelling into their practice around communications, that it seems to take longer to begin with because they're learning how to do it.
Yes.
But my point always is, if you can do this well, you will find you get less questions about things because people understand what you're trying to say. You know, say you've got a new strategy and you're trying to communicate it. If you use storytelling techniques, people are more engaged. They remember more of it, so you'll get less questions.
Yes.
And further down the line, if you're trying to introduce a change or a new way of working, you'll probably find you get less issues around it because people are more brought in and you're taking them along with you, rather than if you just stood up and presented a load of PowerPoint slides.
Indeed. And another aspect of this way of working is that you contextualize people's questions. So one of my favorite questions at the beginning of a consultation is, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself? Or what do you think I need to know about your life to make sense of this problem that you're bringing me? Or how is this impacting on your life, and how is this impacting on others around you? And you learn so much contextual information. And ironically, it's more useful in medical diagnosis and in medical management than it is to go straight into the sort of traditional clerking questions of, when did the pain start and what makes it better and what makes it worse and how long does it last? All of that stuff, which we're taught to do in a very ritualistic way, but actually saying to somebody a question like, is there anything important I need to know about you? To make sense of what's going on here, and they will come out with the most remarkable things, not just the standard ideas, concerns and expectations which GP learners are trained to ask routinely anyway now, but quite unexpected things, things from left field, things from out of the box that suddenly make you understand the problem in a completely new perspective.
And I wanted to delve into this art of inquiry in a bit more detail, because when you were explaining about narrative-based practice, you talked about the attentiveness and the listening that a patient might feel had been shown to them during a consultation. But I know you say that it's more than just that. It's inquiry, yes. But it's inquiry in quite a focused way. And I loved the analogy that you use in your book about it's weaving a tapestry, not digging a hole. And I'd like to explore that in a bit more depth, because I think it's something that comes up often, certainly in conversations I'm having with people about inquiry. It's another big part of my work. People think it's just asking more questions, but it's not, is it?
No, indeed. Well, let me first talk about that other set of metaphors that you've just mentioned. One is digging the hole and the other is weaving the tapestry. Doctors and health professionals generally are taught to do something which is getting to the bottom of things, which is wonderful and necessary, and in many cases absolutely what we're required to do. But we hear an awful lot of stories, an awful lot of narrative that don't actually sound like things. They're muddles or confusions or uncertainties. We have patients come to us with what has actually become my favourite opening, which is, well, I don't really know where to start, doctor. And these are not things, and they're unlikely to have bottoms. So what we need to do instead is to do exactly what you've just said, which is to weave us tapestry. We ask a question. That's a thread in the tapestry, a first thread. They give an answer. We ask another question. That's another thread. And together we weave something which is actually much more novelistic. It's more like jointly constructing a short story together that actually makes sense for the patient, and it makes sense for the practitioner too. And in order to do that, we teach a basic set of techniques. Now, I always emphasize this is not how to do narrative practice. This is not how to do conversations inviting change. It involves an awful lot more. It involves empathy. It involves intuition. It involves a whole range of different aspects of oneself. But there are certain techniques you need to learn in order to do the basics of conversations inviting change, CIC. And the first is to use a question-based approach and to make your questions genuinely curious. So that usually means they need to be open, they need to be short, they need to be simple, and they need to allow a space for the narrator to talk probably 5 or 10 times as much as you do. That's the first thing. The second thing is to follow on from something that's already been said. We counsel people, don't have your questions ready to take off like, planes waiting to take off at Heathrow or any airport. Have your questions crafted to respond to the particular words that somebody says. I had a conversation recently where at the very, very end of the consultation, and I think I'd missed quite a lot of points going along it, and he suddenly said, I think I really feel quite guilty about all of that. And so I was able to say, well, tell me about that guilt. How do you think you might manage that guilt? And it took us into a whole new area. So there's something about picking up words and phrases and using them to help the person construct the next sentence, the next chapter, the next episode of their story. And the third thing we teach, and that's quite counterintuitive for most doctors, which is to withhold advice, withhold guidance, withhold interpretations, withhold formulations. Don't say traditional things like, well, it sounds to me as if, or I think what's really going on here is. We call that colonizing the person's narrative. It's not creating a space for them to extend and expand their own narrative. It's offering yours in their place. And a lot of people are particularly surprised that we are not hugely in favour of reflecting back. Because reflecting back, when you say, so I understand what you're saying is, if you analyse that carefully on tape or on video, you find that the practitioner has inevitably substituted some of their own words, and they are not actually the patient's words. So we advise that the best way to demonstrate that you've understood isn't by reflecting back, but is by asking a question that is so on target that the person instinctively feels, gosh, they must have understood me, otherwise they wouldn't have asked that question. We have a whole lot of other teaching which people are quite surprised by or regard as counterintuitive. For example, we don't routinely ask the question, how did you feel about that? Of course, there's often a place for that question, but we don't ask it routinely because we find for a lot of doctors it becomes automatic. They ask it, but it isn't authentic. It fills the space. Their eyes are actually glazed over, and they're asking it because it just seems generally a good thing to ask, but it's not particularly connected to the patient's narrative at that moment.
I'm nodding away while you're talking because
it
takes me back to years ago when I first started out in consulting. We were all sent on a course about active listening, and
yes.
Everything that we were taught is exactly what you were saying you don't teach. And at the time, it felt very odd to me that to show that you were listening
yes.
to somebody, you had to parrot back to them what they just said to you.
Exactly.
And I remember thinking at the time, this would just really annoy me if someone did this to me. Because as you say, inevitably you get the words wrong, you insert your own interpretation, your own sense making of what they've been saying. And to me, it's not a good way to show that you're listening. The well-crafted question, which, as you've said earlier, moves them forward, to me is a far better way of showing that you're listening. It's probably harder than just parroting back what you've heard, but ultimately is the ultimate sign of attentiveness. So it's really interesting to me that that's what you are teaching.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that, Susanne, because I think these techniques, which are so widely taught, actually bring a kind of static aspect to the conversation. It slows it down, or it makes it stop. So what you're saying is, so what I'm hearing is, rather than introducing the idea of flow, introducing a sense of further horizontal movement into the narrative and constantly keeping in the air the idea that we are going somewhere, we're on a journey together, we're on an act of creation together. This isn't about me mirroring you or echoing you or simply affirming you. It's actually jointly going in a particular direction, and it's a direction of your choice that you know we're then pursuing together.
And I liked what you said earlier as well about asking a question that takes the other person to a place that they hadn't been to before.
Yeah.
And I think we've all been in that situation where someone has asked us something and it's made us think, and we've thought, oh, I've never thought about it that way before. I've never been asked that question before. But it forces us to think and work. And I think there's something rather lovely about someone asking you that sort of question. I love it when it happens to me because it just, as you say, it moves the story forward. It moves your thinking forward.
Yes. One of my other favourite questions, and I think I ask it probably on about 90% of cases when I have a conversation with somebody, is what are you hoping to get out of this conversation? And then to take regular temperature checks. How are we doing in this conversation? Where are we getting towards where you were hoping to get? Where have we got so far? Where do you think we still need to get? And also, do you still now want the same thing out of this conversation that you did when you started, or are you now in another place? And interestingly, people often say, well, I know I came in with a particular set of requests or wishes, but actually now we've had this conversation, I think I want to explore something else. I think I want to go somewhere else. And the classic story, and I have to apologize because I've written about this in a number of places, and I tell this story almost every time that I speak about narrative practice, is a patient who came to see me with the opening words, "I've got 3 problems, doctor." And intuitively I said, "And what's the 4th?" And she told me. And I don't know whether it was a problem that she already knew she wanted to talk to me about and actually was sort of testing me out. Would I be good enough with the 3 problems that she'd have the courage to tell me about the 4th? Or is it possible, and I think actually it's quite likely, that it was below consciousness somewhere, probably quite, not far below consciousness, but something was nagging her that was ready to pop out if somebody asked the right question. And that's another thing. I had somebody recently saying, it wasn't the question you've just asked, but something just popped into my mind. And we then discussed why had it popped into her mind, what had helped it popped into her mind, and what exactly was it. So we actually, if you like, anatomize that whole process of things popping into one's mind and what it means and why it's so important. And it's more important than giving the prepared answers that, the patient sat in the waiting room thinking, I'm going to say this and I'm going to say that and I'm going to say the other, and I've got a list and all these things. But actually, again, these produce quite static conversations. And what produces a dynamic conversation is the person who says, gosh, something's just popped into my mind. And that's what I call a narrative shift. That is something new in the consultation that neither of you were expecting.
And I guess there's a real skill to that, isn't there, in recognising what's underneath. So we can all see what's on the surface, but that recognising something else that's driving it. I wonder with a lot of patients and actually people generally, they present with a problem, but it's actually driven by something else that even they might not know about.
Yes. As professionals, we're taught to pay attention to particular words, pain, bleeding, anything like that. But actually, it's those little colloquial phrases that we really need to pay attention to. The something's just popped into my mind. I mean, I can remember days long ago when my heart used to sink hearing a phrase like that, because I think, oh my goodness, we're going to go on a long meander somewhere irrelevant. And I'm going to hear all sorts of information I don't need in order to make the diagnosis, I don't need in order to recommend treatment, and actually was completely missing the point that those little phrases are the openings. They're like the doors or the windows that are going to take you into new dimensions of the person's life. And that's the stuff you need to go to. You need to hear the words that doctors are almost trained to tune out from. And one of my dear colleagues, who's sadly no longer with us, used to describe my work as remedial therapy for selective brain damage. Because he used to say doctors are actually institutionalized into not listening. They're institutionalized into listening in a very kind of restricted and diminished way. So your next door neighbor or your hairdresser might actually be more curious about the phrase something's just popped into my mind than a doctor or a nurse or a health professional. Isn't that ironic? And I often teach that you should watch your hairdresser keep a conversation going. They are absolutely brilliant because they absolutely spot the cues to ask the question that keeps the ball in the air. They have to, because otherwise their customers won't feel that they're interested in them and they won't come back. So that's the way you keep a conversation going, not just on this occasion, but to keep a relationship going, to build a relationship of trust.
That's such an interesting point. I remember I was listening to another podcast you've been on, the Deep Breath In podcast. I think it's the BMJ.
Yes.
And you were talking there
Yes.
about the art of paying attention, and you gave a particular example of around the cues that could be missed. And I think you told a story, and correct me if I'm wrong, of a patient who'd come in with headaches, and said that they were driving them to despair. And that sort of description of how they were feeling, I imagine, is the bit that would be ignored. So it's the headache would be the focus rather than all the other things around it.
Absolutely. And you have to think almost like a literary scholar who is applying close reading to a text. And you're thinking, why was that word chosen? It may just be a throwaway colloquialism. I don't want to say that every time somebody uses the phrase, it's driving me to despair, that there must be kind of, suicidal ideas behind it. But you have to be curious and to say, can I just ask, was there a reason you chose the word despair? And they may just say, I'm not serious. And from their smile and their body language, to trust that and to go with it. But actually they might say, well, I've not really been able to tell anybody this, but it is taking me to the point where I'm not entirely sure I want to go on living. And unless you actually interrogate the words like a close reader, you won't know which of those directions you ought to be exploring the narrative in.
Yeah, I think that it is that paying attention. I talk about it all the time in my work. Leaders in organisations need to pay attention to what they're seeing and hearing around them. There's a lot of talk in organisation, but not a lot of attention often, and that's really chimes in with the work that I do, I think.
Yes, there's a great narrative medicine scholar in New York called Rita Sharon, very well known. She is both a physician at Columbia University, and she's also a literary scholar in her own right. She has a PhD in literature. And she talks about three aspects of narrative medicine. One is attention, the second is affiliation, and the third is representation. It's sometimes called the narrative medicine triad. Attention, well, I actually prefer the word attentiveness, but it's an attitude of really being there with the person, but particularly with the words that they're using, as well as their body language and their emotions and everything else. Affiliation is the building up of trust through that attentiveness, that this is the creation of a relationship. It might be a relationship with 10 minutes because you're seeing somebody once off in an accident and emergency department, or it might mean a lifelong affiliation in which you end up providing end-of-life care to them. And representation is interesting. We don't focus so much on this in our courses, which are very much about the spoken word, but Rita focuses a lot on the importance of being able to represent somebody's story in your own writing. So to be able to write a history in an unconventional way that also includes the whole of the person's narrative, not just the medical history, that actually captures something of them. It's also the ability to write a diary for oneself, to actually develop your own thoughts through writing, what Wordsworth called emotion recollected in tranquility. And it's the ability to do creative writing as well, to encourage doctors to actually do creative writing, to write for themselves, to write poetry, to write in a way that hones their attention to words. Now, as I say, we don't teach that so much in narrative practice, but there are whole schools of narrative medicine that are based on honing doctors' attentiveness and their capacity for affiliation through representation in the written word as well.
That's really interesting. And I think that idea of writing is becoming more of a recognised practice for yes. your own sense making, for exploring feelings and difficult situations. I know I've read various things about how narrative practice can be used for doctors to download, I don't know whether that's the right word, but to work with perhaps situations that they found very difficult, either with colleagues or through their own writing. And I think that's a really interesting field.
Yes, I think reflective writing is a very effective way of processing your reactions to an encounter, particularly if it's perturbed you, it's caused disturbance. It is what we call a form of self-supervision, that you supervise yourself by writing it down. We do have one writing exercise where we ask people to write down a 2 or 3 sentence account of what they consider to be the most routine or banal consultation they have had in the last few days, and then to have a conversation with one of their peers about it, and their peers apply these techniques of curiosity, the open questions, the following feedback, the withholding advice, and so forth. And then we ask the person to write down a newer version that's a page long that incorporates the thoughts that they've had while they've had the conversation. So it's an exercise that combines narrative practice through the dialogue with representation through the writing down, and almost invariably they find the story that they've written down at the end of that exercise is hugely richer than what began as a completely banal encounter. They may have written, "I saw a 3-year-old child with a sticky eye," and I reassured the parent and advised them just to wipe the eyes and keep them clean because it wasn't bad enough. And it's very, very kind of banal medical account. And by the end, they've remembered that they've seen the mother before, and they know something about the family, and they know the whole background, and they wonder why the child came with a sticky eye on this occasion, because actually it was quite mild, and perhaps they should have asked a question that they hadn't asked or will ask on the next occasion. I mean, it broadens out, and it makes them aware of the fact that I sometimes say every narrative is pluripotent. Every narrative has the potential to go in a multiplicity of different directions, and it isn't possible to explore all of them or even a small proportion of them on any occasion. But you can hold in your mind that on any occasion you are making choices about where you go and where you don't go. And once you become aware of that choice making, you then become able to hand that choice over to the patient and say, "So where would you like to take this? What's important for you? What direction would you like to go in now? And what will help you get the most out of this conversation, however long or short it is?"
That's really interesting. What I'm noticing in all the things that you're talking about in terms of this practice is that there needs to be a certain confidence on the part of the practitioner to operate outside of, I suppose, having a set of guidelines or a set of questions that you ask. And I know when we've spoken previously, you talked about you're not ever going to be an expert in all of this, but it's about becoming comfortable with feeling slightly uncomfortable. And that's the place where, if you're wanting to delve into this practice, that's where you need to begin, is that stepping out of your very comfortable practice into something that perhaps feels a bit more difficult.
I actually use the word faith. It's a slightly pious sounding word, but I say you have to have faith that every narrative has its own momentum and it will go where it needs to go. It's like letting a dog off the lead in the park, and you then follow wherever the dog wants to sniff. And you are led by the narrative, and you think, this is going to go somewhere. I don't need to worry where it's going to go. If you allow somebody the freedom to tell their story, they will take you in the direction they need to go, even if they didn't know initially that's where they needed to go. So it is an act of faith. And you're absolutely right. The confidence develops. And the more the confidence develops, the more enjoyable it all becomes, the less prone you are to exhaustion and burnout. One of my favorite pieces of feedback from a course ever was from the very first course that we taught maybe 25 years ago, Caroline Lindsay and I, and one of the doctors who I think was a doctor from what you would call a deep end practice, a practice with a lot of deprivation, very, very heavy workload. And she wrote in her final feedback, "It has liberated me from the role of Dr. Fix-It."
How wonderful.
So it's providing you with that kind of faith.
Wow. And I think that, I can see how this would transfer into organisations also, that how often,
yes.
And you'll have seen this in your own work in organisations, leaders and managers
Indeed.
take on this role of having all the answers and
yes.
being able to solve everybody's problem. How liberating it would be that you realised that wasn't your role and you could do something different. It would be amazing for people.
Yes, I no longer run an organisational consultancy service, but I used to run, as you say, a team development service for Health Education England, the London Deanery as it was before. And I used to have a particular approach that I wrote about, actually, that I called concentric conversations. I'd be approached usually by one person who might be a medical director or chief executive, and I would sit them down and I'd hear their story. And then I'd say, look, you've mentioned one or two other people in this story, people that you regard as close allies, people you feel you can work with. Would it be all right if we drew the two of them into the next discussion we have? And then I do the same with the three of them. And gradually we'd widen and widen the circle until it included the people that they had initially identified as problematical. And as you drew people into this kind of narrative circle, this widening narrative circle, the people who had been stigmatized or identified as problems, they got drawn into this kind of new culture of having conversations in a different way and having conversations in which things were shared that hadn't previously been shared. And I don't need to tell you this, Susanne, but sometimes it turned out that the people who had been identified as the problematical ones were struggling with particular issues of their own that they needed to share, or perhaps just as other people were wanting them to go, they were thinking of leaving. But these thoughts, these stories hadn't been shared. Or it turned out that they had a tremendous amount to give, that they had a tremendous amount of creative potential, but they were being thwarted by people who regard themselves as benign and positive, but there were certain things that they weren't able to hear. So we were able to introduce a very different kind of conversation into the organizational cultures. I did a lot of work around bullying. And with bullying, we found in particular there were often two parallel narratives that were completely mismatched. And one narrative was, I'm being asked to do things I've not been fully trained to do. I'm being asked to do things that are really above my pay grade, or that I find very difficult or challenging, or I'm being bossed to do them when I don't actually want to do them or don't have the time. And the other parallel narrative was, I want to bring out the best in these people. I want to take them beyond their comfort zones. I want to make them better professionals and more skilled professionals. I want them to learn to take risks, all these things. And you had these parallel narratives going on, and there was a complete mismatch between them. That's not to say that there isn't real bullying and serious bullying, and bullying that, crosses a line into what is unacceptable and breaches guidelines and may even breach the law on harassment and discrimination and goodness knows what else. But very often, the key element was mismatch, and you had to say, okay, how are we going to bridge these two different views? How are we going to address this mismatch of stories?
Yes, and I think, again, I'm nodding along with everything that you're saying, because my own views on these sorts of situations has definitely changed over the years. So when I started out in consultancy, working mostly in the area of organisational change, as consultants, we used to get really frustrated with people in the organisation who we perceived to be resisting and sort of thwarting our efforts to create change. Over the years, I think as my own practice has changed, my own approach has changed, I've realised, a bit like what you were saying, these people had a different narrative that needed to be heard, or the way I often characterise them now is like as a super engager. So they were super engaged in the process. They just had different ideas to everybody else. That doesn't make them bad ideas. They just had questions and ideas. And instead of dismissing them, it was about bringing them into the circle. So I think your idea of concentric conversations is fantastic.
There's another thing that I've found narrative approaches are really useful. And I over the years done a lot of what you might call performance work with doctors who are maybe in trouble with the GMC or with other regulatory bodies, and they may be doing things like, they're trying again and again and again to appeal, and then another appeal, and then another appeal, when it seems to be absolutely clear to everybody that, to put it bluntly, that the game is up. And I once remember saying to such a doctor, what is it that keeps you going in all of this process? And he said, my wife won't let me stop. And then we had a completely different kind of conversation, which is actually the people he should have been talking to were actually not his lawyers, it was his wife. So you've got a completely different story, you've got a different opening, and you're actually having a human conversation that frankly was deeply moving. So you're moving from something where you, along with everybody else who's meeting this person, are actually quite frustrated and irritated that it seems perfectly clear that there is only one direction that this is going to go in. And actually, you have a different sort of conversation that is going to make it acceptable, tolerable for this person to go in that direction.
Wow. I think that's such a great illustration of the power of these sorts of conversations, and asking the right questions gets you to a point that if you carried on using, the normal approach, and I'm using inverted commas there, you never would have got to that point, and it would have been distressing and time consuming and probably very costly for everybody.
Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. John, it's been so wonderful talking to you today. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your wonderful practice. I think everybody listening would hope that any medical practitioners that they have contact with would have an understanding of your approach, because it would make such a difference to everybody.
Well, it's been an enormous pleasure for me, Susanne, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this podcast.
You're very welcome. Before you go, I just wanted to ask, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where's the best place for them to take a look?
We have a website, which is quite simply www.conversationsinvitingchange.com, and they will find a lot of material there, including videos, articles, other podcasts, but also, perhaps most importantly, links to training courses and workshops, or information about how to ask us to come to your organisation or your group of professionals and offer them.
Wonderful. John, thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Susanne.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation, and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.